Hey everybody, Pete, A Turner, executive producer and host of the Break It Down Show. Recording my intro today from the backyard. It's sunny outside. There are jets flying, airplanes buzzing, helicopters whirring, and birds chirping, garbage trucks driving, all while I record this on my bulletproof podcast rig, a Zoom H6 recorder, and Shure SM35 microphone. This is the bulletproof podcast rig, and it is so because it's portable. It's not too sensitive, yet sounds fantastic. Not paid to say that. That's just my quality recommendation on how to get a podcast going. All right, beyond that, today's guest, Boris Havel, is a PhD professor from the University of Zagreb. He joins Dr. Timothy Furnish, who also is a PhD, both of them who have a deep knowledge of Islam, the Middle East, the Orient in general. And we're going to have a conversation about how we deal with places like Iran, how we deal with Islam and its role in America, how do we also deal with Christianity, and all of these different things as they come together and make this sort of a crazy fabric. What do we do? What makes sense? And have an actual rational, sane conversation. Both of these guys who study Islam at the highest level and are passionate about it have been called Islamophobes. We're going to get past that. We're going to understand truly what's important about Islam. Instead of calling people names, let's hear the experts talk. Let's go forward and let's learn a little something. Hey, here's how you can support the show. Share the show. Tell your friends about the show. Buy the shirts. Anything. Talk to me about what you want to see. I'd love to hear what you want from guests. Too many veterans, not enough veterans. More women, less women. Whatever it's going to be, let me know. And definitely know that we're all out there working on this together, trying to tell these great stories. The last thing, and you know what I'm going to say next, Save the Brave. Hopefully you all are at least clicking on savethebrave.org. That's all I'm going to ask for today. All right, here comes Boris Havel.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay
This
Moore.
is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Morata.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, I'm Boris Havel. I'm lecturer at the University of Zagreb, and you are listening to Break It Down Show.
Yes, the Break It Down show is international, as you all know, and we love the Balkans. I was at a recent conference celebrating 70 years of NATO, and Boris and I were on the same panel. We were talking about Islam, and that's actually what Dr. Rich Ledet and I were presenting our upcoming paper on understanding that while we may have the separation of church and state, when we go to a state like the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan or to Iraq, where on the flag it says the words Allah Akbar, we ought to understand and consider how important religion is, not only in our country really, but also in those places where it's a center thing. So if we're going to talk about religion, going to talk about Islam, we have to bring in Dr. Tim Furnish. So, because one, he's a historian. His study of history focuses on Islam and eschatology, and also he was an Arabic linguist. So, you've got one of the world's foremost experts on Islam and religion and how it impacts our foreign policy, and you have Boris, who's equally skilled. So I'm going to be quiet for most of the part and let Tim do a lot of the question asking, because these two guys are among the heaviest hitters in the world in this field, and I know it's going to be fascinating. Hey, Tim, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Pete. I'll try to do my best, although we're not discussing albums today.
Yes.
I'll do the best I can. Well, Pete, I think maybe we should start out with something that we were talking about, Boris and I, a moment ago before we came on air. And Boris made the very interesting statement with which I totally agree, but I wanted to go ahead and let him flesh it out, which is the idea, I believe, Boris, you said something along the lines of policymakers really need to understand, and if I'm paraphrasing it wrong, correct me, religion in general, but in particular, considering what's going on in the world, they need to understand Islamic history, but they tend to not want to do that. So can you take it from there for a bit?
Yes, sure, I can do that. Well, I live in Europe, and Europe is very heavily opinionated when it comes to ideologies and religions. And when they discuss phenomena such as Islamic State here in Croatia, but also in other European countries, they almost always use also the term so-called Islamic State, thus implying that it's not really Islamic and it's not really a state, but basically that it's not Islamic. And so recently I wrote an article in Croatian language. And by the way, Croatia is not in the Balkans. We are Mediterranean.
Oh, my
country. That's very
apologies.
important. Yeah. Balkans, that's east and the south of us.
Okay, fair enough.
Anyway, I wrote an article about explaining why Islamic State is not so cold, but it really does follow early Islamic beliefs, practices, and historical narrative about the early caliphate, the Ar-Rashidun. That article was not really very much understood. Why? Because most, even scholars of Middle East in Croatia and in Europe, do not know early Islamic history. Why? They've never studied it because there is no place to study it. I studied it in Israel. Why there is no place to study it? Well, generally because of Edward Said and his pamphlet Orientalist, in which he proclaimed the whole discipline illegitimate. Europe followed the suits, laid down great schools of Oriental studies that we had in 19th and early 20th century. So basically, it's very hard today in Europe to get to know what early, and it's a fascinating field, what early Islamic history, teaching, theology really is. Now, when modern Middle Eastern actors such as, let's say, Hamas or Islamic State refer to those early Islamic texts and make them relevant for modernity, you have very few, even scholars, who understand what they are talking about when it comes to politicians, journalists, and diplomats. They basically have no slightest clue. And that's a problem.
And I would add to that, Boris, that many of them don't want to have a clue. I was at a conference a couple of years ago. Pete, you'll find this interesting. It was in the D.C. area, Arlington. Of course, everything has to be in Arlington, right?
Yeah.
And it was put together by a think tank, and there were, State Department people there and three-letter agency people there. And we were discussing things having to do with Iraq and Afghanistan. And we got into a discussion sort of just like Boris was talking about. And I was pointing out, well, wait a minute, this stuff comes from early Islamic history, and this stuff's in the Quran. You can't just dismiss it. Finally, and then there was a State Department fellow next to me that kept arguing with everything I said. And finally, I said to him, have you ever actually read the Quran? And his response was, I don't need to.
Oh, boy.
Oh, man.
So, yes, exactly. And I think that goes exactly what Boris is saying. I mean, it's on both sides of the Atlantic. The intelligentsia, or the self-proclaimed intelligentsia of Western civilization, most of them, there are a few exceptions, but most of them seem to have bought into this idea that if you point out that if you take our enemies at face value, ISIS, the Islamic Republic of Iran, groups like that, take them at face value and actually give credence to what they're saying motivates them, that's somehow discriminatory, or that's somehow of course, Islamophobic. And I never understood. I mean, when the Nazis were espousing Nazi ideology, no one went around saying, well, we can't talk about Nazi ideology because it will make the Germans look bad. Or when the Soviet Union still existed, and the Comintern was using Marxist-Leninist ideas to try to overthrow and undermine governments around the world, we didn't go, oh, we can't discuss that because that might upset the Russians. But yet we have this idea now that is embedded, as Boris points out, embedded in the minds of most of academia and far too many policymakers that you can't unpack Islam and look at Islamic history and say, wait a minute, this idea of jihad, maybe that's not radical. Maybe it's not something that popped up in the 20th century when most of the people that write for the New York Times were born in the late 20th century. Maybe that has been around a little bit before that. So, and I will add, by the way, since I brought it up, that I, and Pete knows this about me, it drives people nuts, but I still think it's a point worth making. I really have a great deal of trouble with, in fact, I bridle at the usage of the terms like radical and extremist. Because as I point out repeatedly, both in terms of Quran and Hadiths, alleged sayings of Muhammad, Islamic history, and modern beliefs of many Muslims, waging jihad is not radical. Waging jihad is mainstream in Islamic history. People in the West use the term radical or extremist, I think, as a synonym for militant or violent. But there are reasons that there are different words for those things. But anyway, to get back, Boris, I think, is exactly on to what's going on. And I'm just interested that you've managed to publish that and actually have a position in the university still, Boris.
Let me jump in and ask a question to you guys, because we do get caught up in these words that actually have meaning, but we never slow down to actually consider, transphobia and Islamophobia. Is it possible for either of you to be Islamophobes? Like, to me, on the surface, that seems to be preposterous, because how can you have an irrational fear of something that you're obviously passionate enough about to go study, and in a field that's not exactly computer science where I'm going to be cutting edge and have a chance to make a lot of money. Like, you guys are studying something that is hard to study and produce information that gets out of your specific silo. Is it possible for you guys to even be Islamophobes?
Well, Pete, please let me just before that's a great question, excellent question. But before we get to that, let me just follow up on what Tim said.
Please.
When he compared attitude to Nazism and communism, because it's very important, and I'm very happy that he brought it up. Namely, whenever in history we had an organized mass movement of people, there was a theory behind it. And as social scientists, we know that there is no movement without a theory behind it. So when we talk about communism, it was a theory of communism, of course. All these movements, whatever you call them, I mean, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, they were all prompted by some sort of theory. And it was common knowledge to social scientists that studying a theory to understand a movement is essential. Now, perhaps for the first time in history ever, we have an organized movement, and so many, if not most, social scientists approach it as if there is no theory behind it. And I'm talking about jihadism now, which is extremely amazing to me, because it puts down the basics of scholarship to do whatever else, to be politically correct, to be nice to Islam, to be nice to the dean of the university or whatever. But this is something that is unprecedented in scholarly history in the last 500 years, I believe. Tim, please correct me if you think I'm wrong.
No, that's a very, I never heard it put that way, Boris, but that's exactly right. And I would add with that I think it's been tied up with, and as you point out, the genesis of the ignorant thinking on this was created by Edward Said. And just quickly, for people that don't know, basically the two poles of authority, if you will, in modern scholarship on the Middle East and Islam in particular, are Edward Said and Bernard Lewis. Dr. Lewis, who died not long ago. Bernard Lewis was old school and was tarred by Said as an Orientalist. That is to say, Bernard Lewis was convinced, as those of us, a number of us in the field are, but we're a minority, I think, that to understand another culture, you have to really be able to know at least one of that culture's languages. I mean, it's really hard to be an expert on Russian history if you don't know Russian. It's really hard to be an expert on Chinese history if you don't know Mandarin. And so in this case, Bernard Lewis always said that since he was an expert in this, of course, this was easy for him, you need to know Arabic or Persian or Turkish. And, he knew all three, of course. In order to understand Islamic civilization, you have to be able to read the texts in their original languages. And this is one thing that often differentiates us, those of us that are historians, from political scientists, because political scientists generally don't tend to have that same sort of belief. But anyway, Edward Said came along with this book, 78, right? Orientalism came out in 1978. And it is not an exaggeration to say that it's a Bible for the people on the left when it comes to area studies. And basically, Edward Said accused Lewis and other Western scholars, English, French, German, American, Croatian, who study particularly the Middle East and know the languages, at least one of the languages. What was his term, Boris? Appropriating Islamic culture or something. I don't know how you appropriate a culture. That seems really strange to me. Yeah. But basically his argument, which has so many holes in it, it's ridiculous, more holes than, the Democrats' impeachment articles. Basically, the idea was that Western scholars only learned about the Middle East and learned languages so they could help with colonialism, although, Catholic, for instance, in particular, Catholic scholarship about Islam goes back into the Middle Ages, right, Boris? It long predates colonialism. So anyway, those are the two poles of authorities. And basically the Sa'idians are of the opinion that anytime anybody in the West studies the Middle East or the Islamic world, it's with nefarious motives. And I think this, and sorry for that long disquisition, but I think that informs a lot of what's going on, particularly on the left. Those sorts of ideas have become an article of faith. Keyed into that too has become the idea of race. The left has successfully inculcated in the popular culture. I run into this all the time. It drives me crazy. Boris, I'm sure you do too. Pete, you see it. That Islam is a race. And somehow a dark-skinned race. Although, I've been to Iran and I've been to Turkey, and those people are whiter than I am, which is saying,
yes,
yeah, they're white.
Yes.
I mean, they're Aryans. Just ask the Iranians; they'll tell you what they are. A lot of that has been, and of course, these people also ignore the fact that there's about 400 million African Christians who tend to be a bit dark, shall we say. But anyway, it's just become ridiculous. This idea that a religion, that an ideology, that a belief system is coterminous with a race. And then therefore, and to go back to what Boris was talking about, therefore they conflate that. So if you point out that jihad was waged by Muhammad, the founder of Islam, which is a historical reality, there's no argument about that, that somehow you can then be dismissed as racist. And therefore your argument is then deemed out of bounds. And this has infected policymakers. It was certainly prevalent in the Obama administration. I used to, Pete, this, I used to regularly lecture at Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, which, Boris, is down here in South Georgia. I live near Atlanta, and it's the main training facility for Homeland Security people in the United States. And after a couple of years, a year or two after Obama was elected, and again, I was a regular lecturer down there on counterterrorism issues having to do with Islamic jihad and that sort of thing. And I was informed that I would not be employed anymore because the edict had come down from on high, meaning from someone in the Obama administration, that any counterterrorism lecturer who discussed the concept of jihad was therefore was not going to be employed anymore. So basically, to go back again, Boris, to what you said, you're not even supposed to talk about jihad, although our enemies talk about it constantly, and they proclaim all the time that's what they're waging against us, and that's what's motivating them, but we aren't supposed to discuss it.
Well, look, you can talk about it. You can talk about it. Well, for example, in Croatia, you can talk about it, and I can tell you a little bit more. Why is that so? You might want to know this interesting piece of information. Said's book, Orientalism, has been translated into Croatian language by the Soros Society, funded.
Why am I not surprised?
Exactly, and published. But when you speak to an ordinary Croat and you say Soros, most people know him, loathe him, and don't want to go down that path. But you see how much it is an ideological and not a scholarly issue. So basically, what they have created when it comes to studying of Islam, jihad, and especially, as you mentioned, early Islamic history, because that's what's really important. It's not really important who's killing whom at this moment in Baghdad. It is important how many people and why early Muslims killed, including the Muslim prophet Muhammad. Now, when it comes to modern scholarship about Islam, unlike, of course, scholarship about Christianity, Judaism, or any other faith, what is important is not to have a correct methodology, but a correct ideology. And that really brings us back into what some people call the Dark Age, when religion determined what allowed and the legitimate scholarship is and isn't. To be back into that age now in 21st centuries is outrageous, and I am really surprised that more scholars are not raising their voice.
Yeah, I mean, we virtually have an index now, but it's not being done by the church. It's being done by groups like Amazon. I mean, I wrote an article back earlier in the spring last year for an online conservative Christian publication called The Stream. And the first article I wrote for them was a review of that Tommy Robinson book about Islam. Now, I'm not a big fan of Tommy Robinson. Okay, I'll tell you that right now. But I mean, I read the book, which he co-wrote with another guy, and basically the book doesn't say anything about Islam that's not true. And it has, and in fact, about half the book consists of an English language translation of the Quran, which highlights the violent passages in the Quran. I mean, Tommy Robinson didn't write that, but yet that book was eventually banned from sale on Amazon. And after which Barnes & Noble and another large seller in the United States called, which you may not know, Boris, called Books A Million, you may know, all of them followed suit after Amazon. So that book is almost impossible to get now. Why? Just because of what you just said, Boris.
Yeah. Well, we have a book, Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasul Allah, which is the earliest chronological biography of Muslim Prophet Muhammad. And it's a very interesting chronological, that's the only early Islamic text which is chronological narrative, really fun to read. Partially answers your question, Pete. I am not Islamophobe. I enjoy reading. I mean, Islam is a great and interesting civilization, and I really enjoyed studying about it, reading about it. And of course, not all there is about Islam is jihad, but jihad is one of the foundations of it. Now, this book has been translated by the chief, by the head of the Muslim community of Croatia and Slovenia. Not exactly translated, but let's say paraphrased, retold. And it's been published in the year 2002 in the Croatian language here in Zagreb under a similar title called Prophet and His Men in Croatian language. Now, if you can, believe it, that book has never been presented to wider auditorium here in Croatia. Almost nobody knows about that book. You cannot find it to buy it anywhere, saved in the mosque of Zagreb, but it's hidden. It's under the desk. So you have to specifically come and ask for that book. And if they do not find you suspect, then you can get it. And it costs just about $25 US. I also searched the internet just recently to show it to my students. You cannot, that's a book published in 2002 by the head of Islamic community here that's been had for more than 30 years. I mean, he's a very, very respected man, and I know him personally. You cannot find that book's cover on the internet, and there is not one library which sells it here in Croatia. Now, mind you, that book is not Islamophobic. That book is written by the chief Islamic authority in this country.
Wow.
So they are trying to, what I assume is they do not want the general public to know about these early texts. That's why I say to my students, if you're a student, the first thing you should have in mind after, keeping in mind the importance of methodology is curiosity. So, I mean, if for no other reason, but for that reason that the book has been hidden for so many years, try to find it and read it. And I think I have motivated some people to start asking questions about it. So it's not, so again, that's a book written by the chief Islamic authority. I mean, he's completely halal. He's recognized by all Muslims here, even though I must also add that Croatian Muslims are by no means interested in jihad, and they are very, very secular, liberal. They eat pork, and it's completely.
They drink. I know those people. I've been with them. Yeah, they're great.
Yeah. But then I ask, so for whom did he write this book? For which reader? If it's to introduce early Islamic history to general public, why did they not present this book to general public? Why to hide this book? So there is something about this book and generally about Ibn Ishaq's narrative that is worth pursuing.
Fellas, I want to ask a question, and thanks for answering the Islamophobia question, because, yeah, the whole point of that is like, of course you're not Islamophobes. You're Islamophiles, if anything. You know, we are just fascinated by that culture, and we're going to have Timothy Mackintosh-Smith on the show in, 2 weeks. And he and John McKay and I are going to talk about his wonderful book, The 3,000-Year History of the Arabs. Turns out Arabs have been around for a long time. Let's try to find a compare and contrast for this, the disdain, the rejection of understanding what the heck we're trying to do when it comes to Islam. What would that be akin to, Tim or Boris? I mean, we can use Catholicism, we can use something non-religious, but it shocks me how much, like, Tim, when you've told me that story in the past about the State Department, we had Ambassador Robert Hunter on the show. Boris, you met him at the conference that we went to, and he talks about just the willful ignorance, you know, to hire the wrong people, to not go ask the people that know. That the fact that you guys aren't helping advise, or that the preeminent person from a country in this field is ignored or disregarded, or you can't read his book that's not even 20 years old. It's shocking to me that we presume to know anything about Islam as a nation or as a group of nations in terms of NATO or any of that stuff. So sorry, I had to vent a little bit, but it's just so damned frustrating to have such a complex thing. You wouldn't dare do that if you were going to go try to work with people who are NFL fans, and you wouldn't even know the players on the teams, let alone the teams.
Hey, this is Pete A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here, and if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
You wouldn't even know the players on the teams, let alone the teams.
I don't know. Both my kids play football, Pete, or in high school football.
Yes.
In fact, one of my sons is probably going to wind up playing in college. So I've learned a lot more about football in recent years than I ever knew in my life. And so, yeah, that's an interesting, and that's, since you brought that up, I think it would be like saying, all right, well, we're playing this team this week, and we know that they blitz a lot. And we know that when they blitz, that they like to, and then some of their guys like to chop block, so which is illegal block sports below the knee. We're talking American football, by the way, just so you know, the good kind. And it would be like saying, okay, well, we're going to watch this film, but we're not going to look at this part where these guys do the chop blocks or where they blitz and they. Maybe grab a face mask or something because we think it makes them look bad. And I'm like, what? That's exactly what you want to prepare for.
What's your example, Boris? Like, how would you, what's the compare and contrast for how we treat Islam and scholarly learning when we're trying to do international policy?
Okay, well, first I should tell you that I know very well what football is because when it comes to world championship, Croatia was second in Russia last year.
That's right.
Finals against French and the judge.
Most Americans, of course, except for those colluding with Putin, were rooting for Croatia. I can tell you that.
Yes, thank you. I know that. Now, to answer your question, I think there is a big problem in approaching modern Islamic threats with the knowledge and the positive knowledge and experience of former threats to the West. That's what I'm writing this article to this university and the conference that you referred to earlier. Namely, when you were facing the threat of communism and earlier of Nazism, you did not have to study their theory. You had to study their tactics of war and their strategies. Now, Islam is different. because if you want to face the threat of Islam, you have to know the theory that lies behind that threat. And if you focus on the war tactics, it can actually get you off the track. Just imagine when the Western world, the free world, was fighting against that evil, which is Nazism. The theory was Nazism, and their war tactics was blitzkrieg, right? Now, just imagine if the Allies would say, we are at war with blitzkriegism.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but that's exactly what Westerners do when they say we are at war with terror. No, terror is a tactics of war, which is
That's a great point.
which
man.
is and there is completely other theory which is behind it, and just because many of the distinguished politicians and military even they won this great victory against communism, they just somehow assume that Islamic threat is somehow similar, and so they continue to pursue tactics, the methods of achieving goals, even goals, but never asking the question, what's motivating these people? Why is it so powerful? Because it can convert people who are Americans, Christians, Jewish, Buddhist, but that was not really the case with the communism, for example. So I believe that political scientists, politicians, but primarily scholars, need to detach themselves from all earlier experiences and focus on Islamic threat as if starting from zero when it comes to analysis of international relations and security issues, because it's so profoundly different.
Pete, Boris, thank you. Well said. Let me add to that, Pete, while I'm thinking of it. I think that I'm glad that he brought that up. And of course, I brought up the comparison to Nazism and communism earlier, but it can be pushed too far. The big difference, of course, is that Islam is a religion. It's not just an ideology. I can tell you how many times I've argued with conservatives on my side of the fence. Islam is not a religion. It sure as hell is. What are you talking about? It's not a religion. Is it a political religion? Yes. Is it far too often violent religion? Yes. But that's not all it is. It's certainly a religion. It's therefore profoundly qualitatively different from Nazism and communism. Nazism and communism were ideologies, which I think some people did hold almost religious fervor about. But look, count up all the Nazis there were at the height of the German Empire in 1943, and you don't get anywhere close to 1.6 billion people. And ditto for communists, because not everybody in the Soviet Union was communist, and certainly in China they don't seem to be anymore. So Islam is the world's second largest religion behind Christianity. So therefore, you can sort of understand where some people are like, well, you shouldn't just unilaterally criticize the world's second largest religion. But as I often point out to people, there's a difference between saying what Islam teaches and what is clearly in the Quran and the Hadith and Islamic history and that sort of thing, and saying that all Muslims believe that. And Boris alluded to this earlier. There's a lot more to Islam than jihad, and this goes back again to pull in what you said earlier about being an Islamophobe. And my wife, I always grouse to my wife about people calling me that. My wife would just shake her head and go, why don't you just tell them you wouldn't have spent 20-some years of your life studying this?
Yes, right.
You hated it so bad, which is basically what you said, Pete. Yeah. My wife sometimes just needs to hit me in the head with something. It's useful. But yeah, exactly, Pete. I mean, I started studying Islam. I actually started as an undergrad before I'd even graduate. I went to a book sale at our college library, and Kenneth Craig's book, The Call of the Minaret. Do you know that book, Boris?
No.
Kenneth Craig was the former Anglican Archbishop of Jerusalem. And the book came out in 1958 or something. And it is still one of the best books ever written on Islam. But so I started studying Islam even before I went in the Army. When I wanted to learn Russian, and the Army made me learn Arabic. So yeah, Islamophobia is just, you don't spend your years studying something like this if you hate it. It's just ridiculous. I have a great deal of respect for Islamic civilization, for a lot of Muslims in general, and the fact that, you know, a small percentage of them engage in jihad and terrorism against the West does not negate the fact that a lot of them don't, of course. But why do they engage in that? Because it is in the text. It is in the example of their founder. Muhammad's a lot different from Jesus. So in that regard, to circle back to what I started with, to follow on from what Boris said, the analytical lens, as well as the response to movements coming out of Islam, have to be different than they were when you're dealing with Nazis and with communists, because it's a religion and it's profoundly different. So you do have to treat it different. And I think a lot of people do tread, you know, it makes them nervous. You're criticizing a religion. I'm like, I don't know. Those people don't seem to have a problem with criticizing evangelical Christians, for instance. But you know, let me add to here, for the sake of complete honesty. I mean, look, I'm a Christian. I happen to think Islam is not, I don't believe the prophetic claims of Muhammad. This is why I refuse to call him the prophet. And I get annoyed when books that are supposed to be books and writers and speakers that are supposed to be objective, refer to Muhammad as the prophet with a capital P. Well, he's a prophet if you're a Muslim. I mean, I don't read, history books refer to him as the prophet with capital P. They don't refer to Jesus as the Son of God, capital S, capital G. Well, if we're going to be symmetrical, we should. But that's just a bit of carping there. But there's a point behind it. And as a Christian, you know, I do not accept the truth claims of Islam. I nonetheless greatly respect Islam as a civilization. As I said, I greatly respect many Muslims for the fact that they live their faith better, or at least they act, you know, I should better. They live their faith more faithfully, if I could say that, than a lot of Christians. And I do respect a lot of things from Islamic civilization. So I'm not one of these people that thinks that because Islam is, because as a Christian, I don't accept the truth claims that there's no good in Islam, because I certainly think that. I mean, C.S. Lewis once famously said, I could not believe Christianity if I thought it was 100% true and every other religion was 100% false. There's truth in other religions. So, or at least good, I guess you could say. But what I try to do, and Boris, tell me where you are on with this, if you don't mind, maybe something to talk about, is I try to disassociate, however, when I do my analysis. Like when I was working for 5 years at Special Operations Command in the J2, I didn't write reports saying, Muhammad's a false prophet and you all ought to be going to church. No, I didn't say that. I basically looked at what ISIS said in Dabiq magazine, for instance, about eschatology and what they wanted to do and why they wanted to rule Syria and what they were trying to spark the U.S. to do. Or, you know, the Westerners, the Crusaders, and then that was my analysis. But it wasn't my view. My view as a Christian of Islam. It was my reading the Islamic texts and what they said, and then taking it at face value and saying this is what we got to take seriously.
Yes, Steve, you're completely. I mean, I really fully agree with you. First, what you mentioned earlier about the theory and the majority of people, of course, they do not follow. Many of them, they do not even know what the theory is of their own religion. We should maybe add to this that Muslims are the greatest victims of radical Islam, because most victims of jihadism are Muslims.
Yes.
But we do not know these numbers so very much because we don't count them as careful as we count Western, European, or American victims. Now, when it comes to comparison with Christianity, and I'm also a Christian and I do believe in Jesus as the Son of God. Now, and when I read the New Testament, and for example, on one page, Jesus says, if somebody hits you on one cheek, turn to him the other. Mm-hmm. Well, most of us Christians know that it's written in the Bible. Now, how many Christians do you know that actually do that? Well, quite a few, right? Not many anyway. And that the same thing is with Islam. First of all, quite few Muslims, especially those who are European Muslims like ours, know at all what's written in Quranic and other early texts. Mm-hmm. But once they find out even, how many of them would follow that? Very, very few. Mm-hmm. So there are these similarities between religions, which I think we should recognize and we can use our own experience in if we are religious to apply in studying and researching other religions. Of course, we should not include in our scholarly researches any religious aspects, because that wouldn't be scholarship. That's a religion. I completely agree with that, and that's why. So I definitely never claim that Jesus is the Son of God. I mean about Trinity, for example, because that's a matter of belief. Now, just let's take another example on that line. When modern scholars and even general publics, but let's keep it to the scholars, the academic community, when they say Christians, Jews, and Muslims worship the same God. No, they do not. But that is an Islamic statement of faith. It says in the Quran, it says that your God and our God is one and the same God. Now, I have full respect for a Muslim that believes that, and that's his belief. My belief as Christian is that I worship God of Israel and God who is Father of Jesus Christ. Allah is not that God. So we have somehow allowed a statement of faith, a purely doctrinal position from Islam to enter our civilization and even our Christian faith. So, for example, you have this Croatian teacher at Yale called Miroslav Volf, who is otherwise, he's a great Christian, he's a great scholar, but he wrote that book, Allah, A Christian Perspective, which is a major, I'm sorry to say, BS from an academic position, because she just outright claims that, of course, it is the same God, and then he explains why is it so. But on the other hand, that's why he's holding position at Yale, and you, Tim, are not. So right. We are now, there are many things which are confused and confusing in this discussion.
Well,
religion,
of course. Let's say real
yes.
quick on that too. That thing that Christians, Muslims, and Jews worship the same God, you will find it in college world history texts. You will find it in a high school history text. And again, this is not some sort of obscure point, Pete. This is important because, as he just said, as Boris just said, in fact, I'm pulling one of my history textbooks out here to find it. I'm looking for it. This basically means that faith claims about Islam are put into the Western educational system as fact, when as a matter of fact they aren't. So, or I should say that it's certainly something upon which many Christians would disagree. But yet people, in the same way that you'll see the prophet, capital P, put in textbooks, people will then be given the Islamic perspective on something as if it were true and as if there were any debate about it among historians, and there certainly is. So this goes back to that whole thing that sort of undergirds most of what we're talking about today, which is that there's just a lot of vast ignorance, much of it intentional, in the West about Islam.
But then look, if you approach Islam assuming that it is the same God, then you assume that there is also a similar position towards ethic and moral issues. Right. And then, of course, when somebody blows himself up to kill some other people or calls for jihad and beheading infidels and so on, you by default, you assume that that's a deviation within that religion, because your position that you start from is that these three are somehow very similar. So I don't know. Maybe the first to disentangle all these stories perhaps should be Christian theologians. And again, I'm not speaking about polemics about Islamic dogmas. Of course, I do not believe that Muhammad was a prophet or something, but I'm talking about Christian apologetics that will defend Christian faith from intrusions from an alien culture, religion, and worldview.
Oh gosh, Boris, that's a whole other can of worms, isn't it, Pete? I mean, and no offense, but we would have to dissect many things that Pope Francis has said. So, boy, I wish you guys had kept Pope Benedict in power, but it didn't work out, did it?
Amen to that.
Let me ask you this too, because we've gotten pretty heady. I want to pull it back a little bit, and just Boris and I had a conversation that isn't possible in the common day-to-day life for at least most U.S. citizens. I can't speak for the rest of the world, but I will speak for most of us. And he basically said, "Don't you guys study, the Orient? Don't you guys study Orientalism?" And I'm like, "Oh, ixnay on the Orientals say. You can't, we can't throw that word around." That's how terrified we are of using the proper words for something. That just, Tim, I mean, do you commonly, and maybe you do, but do you commonly say the word Oriental or Orientalism, or is it just not worth the hassle that you would get for saying that?
Only to make fun of Edward Said. That's the only time I introduced that into the conversation. Then you have to explain it like I did earlier. Yeah, most people don't know. I tend to just talk about area studies, Pete. Which is, again, as I said earlier, you can't be an expert on Russia. And I would argue, but then I'm firmly a Lewisian, I guess you could say, a Lewisian Orientalist. If you're going to be an expert on Russia, you need to be able to read, St. Theophan the Recluse in Russian, for God's sake. You need to be able to, if you're going to be an expert on China, you need to be able to read Sun Tzu and for that matter, Mao in Chinese. Right. So the same applies to the Middle East. Now, that's not to say you can't get a very good knowledge of it with secondary sources. Certainly you can. I mean, there are a lot of people that have done that. But to be truly respected in the field, and I guess maybe unfortunately, but that's the case, right, Boris? You really kind of have to know one of the major languages, at least for many of us. Again, this doesn't apply in English departments because Said has convinced them all that they can be experts on anything just by reading, secondary sources in English. But no, I don't talk about Oriental. I agree with you. I just tend to talk about area studies because, again, you have to unpack that Orientalism thing for people. Yeah. It's like you said, it's a lot of trouble.
Boris?
Well, you've gone too far. You've gone too far when it comes to political correctness, it seems to me, because in Croatia, that's not an issue. I teach a course, undergraduate course at the University of Zagreb, which I teach in English because we have students from other countries, and it's called Oriental Jews and Arabs in Time of Zionism. And I've never had a complaint about the title, and I consider myself an Orientalist. That's what I say. So that's really not an issue here. We are not so. We have had other troubles in our country. We have to be politically correct when it comes to other stuff. For example, we can't criticize European Union. Let's say we all have to be against Brexit, for example. So this is not an issue, but perhaps because there is no so much knowledge about what's politically correct, but then also Croats recently were at war in Bosnia-Herzegovina against jihadism. Right. I recently published an article in which I explained that the Sunnis and the Shia in the last, let's say, 50 years, whenever they got in a conflict somewhere with a third party, be it Soviet Union in Afghanistan or later with the US or now with each other in the Middle East, there are only two conflicts of modernity in which they were fighting against somebody and did not turn against each other. Number one, that's Israel, and number two, that was Croats of Bosnia-Herzegovina. So the issue of relevance of Islam and studying this is more recognized here because of that rather recent experience. And I should also add that several hijackers from 9/11 were waging jihad in 1992 to 1994 in Bosnia-Herzegovina, mainly against Croats. So it's all very, very connected. Now, back to secondary sources. I do not think that we should expect from general public to study such a really, hard and complicated language as Arabic is. There are excellent secondary sources, but also primary sources have been translated into English. You have, I mentioned Ibn Ishaq's Sirah is translated by Oxford University Press back in 1950s. State of New York University has translated complete history of At-Tabari, Tarikh al-Rusul wal-Muluk, the history of prophets and kings, and it's available. You can buy it on Amazon. It's in 40 volumes, 40 volumes, and that's a great read for a scholar who do not have any clue about language, and then they can slowly start to learn language. But also, general public should take some of these books and read, because I mean, you do not have to know Hebrew and Greek to start to read your Bible as a civilizational text. You don't have to be believer. You don't have to share that worldview, but you want to know something about Judeo-Christian faith. Take the Bible in your native language. The same is with Islam. Take those primary sources. Now, why do I say primary sources in English? Because it's very hard to find good secondary sources. Who is promoted in the US, for example? You have that dude called John Esposito. And I would warmly suggest not to read those books, because they are really heavily misleading.
Right.
Take, as you mentioned, Bernard Lewis. But on the other hand, Bernard Lewis, he's not a theologian. He's a very, very cautious. That's a heavy scholarship. He's great. There are secondary sources available. Thinking about some of it, I know the author, but he published under a different name, so I should not mention him now on the air. Who wrote a great book about Islam. There are available. You mentioned an author in the beginning of this show. So I think people should net up, or how would you say, and share the information about good books which are not anti-Islamic. I also do not like that there are some authors who really write books which are heavily biased against Islam. I mean, it's almost on the verge of hate speech, which we all, as scholars and as Christians, we do not want to spread hate towards anybody. We want people to know a theory, and if that theory presents a security threat, that's a great reason to study that theory, but still keeping respect to people who adhere to that civilization or religion, and to love them.
Yeah, Boris, Pete, let me add real quick.
Please.
Boris, thanks for that clarification. What I was talking about earlier was more along the lines of sort of a covert critique of scholars, of the idea that came from Said that you can be an expert in Islam without knowing Arabic or Ottoman, Turkish, or Persian. On the academic level, I think that's problematic. But on the popular level, you're exactly right. And let me add, too, books. The author that I mentioned earlier was Kenneth Craig, who was, again, the former Anglican Archbishop of Jerusalem. And besides writing The Call of the Minaret, he wrote two other wonderful books. One was called Jesus. What was it called? Muhammad and the Christian, and Jesus and the Muslim. And basically, in each of those, he kind of takes the perspective of each religion and looks at the other religion. And by the way, he's very firm Anglican, old school Anglican, not like the modern Anglican Episcopal Church, which has sort of lost its mind, but Orthodox Christian with a small o. But it's a very faithful look at the truth claims of Islam from a Christian perspective, and vice versa. And it's very fair without sacrificing clearly his Christian perspective. So yeah, but there are many. Boris, I totally agree with you. There are many good books in English, French, European languages, particularly in English, however, about Islam, and people should go out there and read it. The problem is, again, many of them will read Esposito and other people that just have an agenda that really don't present the truth.
There's definitely a few tests along the way when I encounter folks who want to talk about Islam at any level. And I am no Islamic expert at all. I just have a lot of practical time dealing with folks in the Islamic world. But like, if you don't have a command of who, or at least an awareness that Al Ghazali exists, you know, like I don't have time for that conversation because you've got work to do, you know, and this is, I'm saying this as a guy that's not been cover to cover through the Quran, but I use the culture of Islam to my advantage, but I know that I'm ignorant. And I ask the questions that an ignorant person asks who's curious. Fellas, what does someone do? I mean, like, they don't need a PhD in this thing, especially, gosh, I hope we're talking to folks that work in foreign policy, international relations, international security, so that they can understand the power of religion in a society. I mean, these things are, you know, when I presented the paper, what got Boris's attention was I was able to talk somewhat intelligently about, you know, Salman the Farsi, you know, who was Muhammad's barber, and how important that was regionally for these people because his shrine was in the area that I was at. So help me understand, like what's just the basics? Like, how do we get to the point where we can at least understand the impact of religion in an area?
I think that the first thing that we should do is to, you know, remember how the West was generally, let's say, civilized. That's the scholars were always at the forefront of bringing knowledge and enlightenment, and out of it came all the good things that we have in this greatest civilization that ever was created on the face of the earth, which is Judeo-Christian Western civilization. So what I basically do is this: I say to scholars, do not get into polemics over Islam, Prophet, same God, not same God. Focus on one word which makes academic and non-academic knowledge different. That is the method. When we bring back the word method into academia and focus on right methodology before anything else, including right ideology, then we will win this battle. But we have to bring back that sacred word of academia, methodology. And it has to apply in studying of anything from medicine and rocket science to political science, history, and Oriental studies. I think it's quite simple. I mean, we should just, you know, define it and go for it.
Tim?
I would add to that, Pete, that as someone who teaches a lot of surveys in Western Civ and world history, particularly the early world history class, when I deal with ancient Near Eastern civilization and Greece and Rome and those areas, that Americans, for the most part, I mean, it sounds like things are better in Croatia, Boris, but Americans, I mean, it sounds based on some of what you said that you have a higher, perhaps, level of undergraduate student than I'm used to, unfortunately. Many Americans don't know much about their own culture and civilization. They are taught. I'll give you an example. In American history, my wife talked about this. My wife was a history major undergraduate, then went to law school. And she said, for instance, like in law school, she said, the only thing pretty much that we learned of American constitutional law and law school was civil rights. That was it. We didn't know anything else about the Constitution. And that's a bit of a slight exaggeration, but I don't think I think it's only a slight exaggeration. So, because, I mean, civil rights are very important. And on the undergraduate level, I know this from a fact. I ask students this every term. Where do you learn about American history in high school? Slavery. They learn about slavery. Okay, now they probably should learn about slavery and the fact that we fought this 4-year civil war that was the bloodiest war in American history to get rid of slavery. They should learn that, but that shouldn't be the only thing they learn. But that, for many of them, particularly in public school here in Georgia, that's mainly what they learn about American history. They don't learn about anything else. They don't learn the importance of Christianity in the development of Western civilization. They don't, and they're also told in public education in America that religion isn't really a topic that you should study because A, it's not important, B, it rubs people the wrong way, or C, all of the above. And so therefore, when we're talking something, the topic we're discussing here today, that in order to understand the threat posed by a violent minority of the world's Muslims, which, by the way, I should add, is not just a violent minority of world's Muslims, because there are a number of Muslims, a larger number, who are certainly not violent, but who wish to change the political system of the West. I mean, we see that clearly happening, which I actually think is a greater long-term threat than terrorism. When that is adduced as a topic that you need to know something about, people's eyes just glaze over because they've been told their whole life that you shouldn't study things like that. You know, religion in America, if you're a Christian, which the majority still identify as, is something you do on Sunday morning, and you're supposed to keep it out of the public sphere. And so, they aren't conversant with the whole idea, as Boris was talking about earlier, apologetics in the sense of being able to defend what you believe against those that don't believe the same. And B, they are taught you aren't supposed to say anything critical about certainly another religion, because that's not being nice, and not being nice, of course, is the main goal of the Christians is to be nice. Don't know where they get that idea, but it's often inculcated. So all of those things make it very difficult to for the body politic, particularly in this country, to look at this issue honestly. And I would add a little late to the game here with this one, but earlier when Boris was talking about this belief that that is presented basically as something everybody agrees on, that Jews, Christians, and Muslims worship the same God, I would add also that basically most Americans have the idea that all religions basically are like Christianity or Buddhism, which is that they teach violence and turn the other cheek and that sort of thing. And when you try to tell them that, well, that's not exactly what Islam teaches, people just either, again, their eyes glaze over and they start drooling, or they reject out of hand what you say because it doesn't accord with what they've been taught. And then when you get people that have gone through those systems, and then God forbid, God knows what they teach at Ivy Leagues on these topics. And then those people get in the State Department and get in policy-making positions in three-letter agencies and in administrations, then you see where we wind up where we are.
Yeah.
Well, to know about Islam is also it's a part of general education, and if somebody doesn't want to learn, I mean, we can do nothing about it, right?
Right.
But for those people who do want, I believe that we scholars have this great tool, invoking method. And by invoking method, we open up for everything else, including those things which are politically incorrect. We can criticize Edward Said. I mean, his pamphlet is very shallow. I mean, he's accusing German Orientalists of working for imperialists when there was no German colony, imperialism in the Middle East. So it's easy to refute those claims, again, based on, but invoking the word, the sacred, I would say, for academia word, method. But the other thing that you also mentioned is the issue of identity. Now, if somebody is not aware and is not proud of his own heritage, for example, the Christian heritage, the great American identity, which I appreciate and admire very much your country, and we are indebted to a degree to you, both for the breakdown of the communism, but also for winning our war. You did at least politically support Croatia. We will never forget it, and we will always be thankful for this. Now, if young people do not cherish their identity, of course, that's a big problem because Muslims from the Middle East have very strong identity, and they are confident that what they do, not only violent jihad, but also pursuit of changing our Western society, as you said correctly, that's an immense threat, not being recognized yet. It's very hard to stand up against that threat. I mean, just look, Western Europeans, especially up in the north, not only are they not sure about their national or religious identity, they are not sure about their bloody gender. I mean, they don't know if they are boys or girls, and now comes somebody from the Middle East, who is, completely confident in the path of Allah. I mean, these dudes stand no chance in confronting him and I'm not talking about violent confrontation, I'm talking about identity confrontation. So definitely we need to get back identities that we have lost somewhere on the way. And I mean, from that matter, it's not irrelevant to remember again that the same sources of financing these identity losses, and I'm referring to Soros again, is the same purse that financed publishing of Edward Said's Orientalism into a European language. There is a strategy on that far left, liberal left, which I believe scholars, especially conservative scholars, should recognize and see how to engage in defending our civilization. But when it comes to politics, I think President Trump is doing great job in helping in the arena of politics.
Well, that's a good spot to stop right there. Leave everybody with the taste of Trump in their mouth. And I'm sure they'll all enjoy that. Hey, Boris, obviously we're going to have to do another one of these because what you and Tim just did for all of us out here who are interested in trying to get international things right and understand religion, gosh, we just need more of these conversations because these books are sitting on the shelf, if they're allowed to be on the shelf. I mean, it shocks the shit out of me that there is a book that's a seminal book from a leading figure in the world on this topic that you can't even wrap your hands around and read. You know, when my brothers and sisters in arms are going to go abroad and go try to answer these problems. I mean, it's, to me, that it's shocking that we're so willfully ignorant and vain about what we know and don't know. I know I don't know enough about Islam, but that's a starting point where I can say, oh my gosh, there's so much more for me to learn, and I already know quite a bit. But fellas,
well, Pete, can I make a shameless plug here and say, hey, folks, go to Amazon and find my books. They're pretty cheap and they'll help you out.
Yeah, that's true. Tim's got and also listen to Tim's earlier episodes than when we talk about Islam because he provides great insight. And actually, we should look back at that one we talked about before President Trump became President Trump on what the next president should do, like what you would advise, because I don't think they followed your advice. So, well, listen. We've been at this for an hour, and you guys, it's the holiday, so I appreciate you taking your time. It's precious. And for sure, Boris, let's get back on. Let's do another one of these.
Yes, Pete, thank you very much it was my pleasure and honor to participate in this. And I'm so glad to have met Tim. Tim, I'll definitely look up for your books on the Amazon. I'm looking forward reading them. I'm happy we met virtually, at least like this. And this is a topic which will not lose its relevance. So I'm sure that Break It Down show will have more opportunities to bring this issue again.
Yes, we will. Thanks, Tim.
Let me say, Pete, gentlemen, it's been an honor sharing the field of ideological battle with you. I may steal a line from the Replacements.